So now we move to developmental methodology. So in this lecture, we are going to first talk about the research methods in our theoretical perspectives. Since we've already gone over them, it's going to be relatively brief though. Then we're going to review the scientific method and then talk about some application. But first, I've got to tell you why this is so important. Most people don't really find research methodology or statistics that interesting. And we're not going to talk about statistics as much as we are going to talk about methodology, but it's really, really important. And you'll probably get the sense from me over the course of the semester that I really care about this stuff. And it's because psychology is a science, and as such, the methodology is really important. And everyone who is taking this class is either interested in the subject matter or required to take it. And if you are required to take it, you're required for a reason. Every major that requires it for a reason. We don't tell you that you as a music major have to take an upper level biology class. The faculty have thought out all of the classes you are forced to take and thought out reasons why. So whether or not you're social work, speech path, physical therapy, sociology, psychology, whatever, all sciences and all social sciences emphasize evidence-based practices. And if you guys have taken any kind of clinical types of classes, be it in psychology or social work or speech pathology, anything, you guys probably will have heard that buzzword before. And why is that so important? Well, it's because it's the only way we know that what we're doing works. So if you want to help vets who are returning from a war, do you want to invest time, money, and possibly the future well-being of the vets on a guess or an opinion? Or do you want to get some really good evidence? Or if you want to help abused children recover from their experiences, do you want to guess? Or do you want to have a pretty good idea that what you're doing could do something? So we have a professional, but even beyond that, a moral and ethical obligation to make sure that what we are doing is the best we can, and if not, then change it. And the only way we can do this is evidence from research. And so, while many of you probably won't really enjoy methodology, it is important to you and your career and most of what you're going to do when you're treating people. That information about why you're doing what you're doing is coming from studies that are incredibly complex and thorough and expensive in ways that you won't even realize now. But it's really important. And even if you don't think that this is that important for you in your career, if you just think you're going to sit at a desk and maybe not be helping people, from a selfish perspective, imagine that you go through something and you need help, or a loved one of yours needs help. Will you want the person who is helping you to have a good idea and solid evidence backing up what they're doing, or would you just kind of want them to go on a whim? Everybody would want that. Okay, so to this point in time, I've talked more research methods broadly, but the large question for us today, the big question is, how are research methods different for developmental psychology and other aspects of psychology? And I just want you to think about this as we're going through the lecture. The last slide, we will revisit this question. So to start revising what we have done with the theoretical perspectives, and these slides, I've literally copied and pasted the methodology slides from the PowerPoints that I used into here so you can see exactly what we went over. So Piaget, remember, Piaget was very well versed because of his biological training in observation and classification. He would watch and record what kids did, just like he watched and recorded what mollusks did. He also learned to add this clinical side to it where he would actually interact and probe the children. He would try to have some kind of interaction, asking them questions. And the one that I gave you the example was him saying, "Where does a dream come from?" kid says, "I think you sleep so well that you dream." Does it come from us or the outside? From outside. What do we dream with? I don't know. With the hands? With nothing? Yes, with nothing. So he would ask questions and probe them to see how their thinking went. And then later in his career, he would add the manipulation of objects in the ways that we saw later. Um, yes. So children also can't fully be questioned about their thoughts. So they also, he and his wife also added this baby diary of observations with their infants, which added some evidence for him to use. So this is largely how Piaget did his work. He took detailed notes about people, and then he also used his clinical method to kind of probe their thinking and added in little experiments later. Freud, as we know, Freud didn't study children. Instead, he studied adults. So we can already see one big methodological difference between Freud and Piaget. And so he just used his techniques, including free association, dream analysis, transference, to look at how adults were thinking about what happened when they were kids, how they interpreted it. Free association, again, is when patients are told just to report whatever comes to their mind, whatever it is, no matter how big or small, no matter how trivial they were asked to bring it up, because he thought that every psychological event, every thought or feeling had relevance, had meaning. Dream analysis. He said if all thoughts were important, that you can't ignore dreams, and so he'd ask people about their dreams and thought that there was this latent and manifest meaning in the dreams. And then finally, transference. This was his notion that the client would transfer the thoughts or feelings that they were having onto the therapist, so they could literally fall in love or hate the therapist. And this was actually critical in his mind because it allowed people to act out or relive whatever experiences or problems they were having. And this, in his mind, helps the analyst discover whatever the true nature of the relationship problems there were. Moving on to Erikson. He had these three big contributions. He had direct observation. He said that we must study man in action and not just man reflecting on reality. Remember that he was Freudian. He was trained directly from Freud's daughter and a little bit of Freud himself. And so this was a bit of a departure where he thought that you actually had to watch people work. And this included his cross-cultural work where he saw that stages were dealt with differently in different places. And this was another big break from Freud. So this adds not only what we have from Piaget, where it's watching people, taking detailed notes about them, and Freud, this kind of retrospective report, but also adding in this cultural variable that until Erikson hadn't been there at all. And then the last one is my least favorite, the psychobiography, his writings of the psychosocial development of well-known people. That is so, in my mind, unimportant. We don't really even need to get into that. Vygotsky used dynamic assessment. He was different in that he thought that anytime you are assessing people, you have to get the dynamic nature of social interaction. He didn't like a single static assessment. So he thought that what you had to do was see how a child acted with the assistance of others to see what they could become. Which is so much less individual. It's the opposite of our individualistic notions that we have in schools and things like that. So a parent could, if there was this the second line, this NGOHPIQJ, if that was a question for a child, we might give that to a child and say, what are the next four blanks? And they'd be on their own to do it. Vygotsky thought what was more important and more relevant was if you were to say, have a parent there or somebody else there and give some cues. So if a parent were to say something like, point to the N and the O in the alphabet and the G and the H, does that help at all? And see if they could get there. Because he thought they could learn and they could eventually get to a point that would be important. It would take out their past learning experiences at least a little bit and let you see what they could become. He also thought that he wanted to see people's microgenetic moments. This microgenetic method is where you try to find people in a developmental moment where people you could actually see them learning at a given point in time. And then observation was also very into observation, took details from observation from anthropology and other areas, but he really more than the kind of anthropology, biological science contribution. The observation really was about seeing people in their natural environment. And then ethology and evolutionary theories. They had the two general methods, naturalistic observation, which is kind of a combination of Piaget and Vygotsky. Piaget because he took detailed notes, but Vygotsky because Vygotsky was more interested in seeing people in their natural environment. And then laboratory experiments. And this is the most sciencey of the things that I've talked about so far, the more what's the right word? Excuse me. Modern. There we go. The more modern contribution. That they would use experiments to see how people or how animals or people would act. But the important thing was they do experiments, but without an understanding of how that behavior was functional in a natural setting, then you couldn't really understand it. So the example I gave you was if you took a squirrel and you put it in some kind of lab experiment and it starts clawing at the ground, at a concrete ground, you say, what the hell is this squirrel doing? You have to understand that that's a thing that squirrels do in order for you to not think that the squirrel is just completely crazy. Okay, so that is our overview of the methodologists, or theorists, but their methodology. So now we're going to move on to talk about research methods more broadly, because our historical perspectives are exactly that. They're historical. There's nobody who I know of who would say that they fit 100% into the mold of any of these theoretical perspectives we've talked about before. So we are going to, in the discussion board, I'm going to give you the opportunity to give some thoughts about how you would answer some of these questions. How would we determine if parental abuse increases depression in children? If increased brain activities in one region increase empathy? If children who watch violent TV are more aggressive? Do children who are more aggressive choose to watch violent TV? Are children of low SES more aggressive and choose to watch violent TV? These are all relatively reasonable questions that we should be able to, as developmental psychologists, come up with some reasonable way to study. You should, by the time this class is over, you should have a decent idea of how, maybe not the exact details, not be able to carry it out 100%, but some of the details of what's important to do when you are researching this. So we're going to get now to the scientific method, but before we talk about it in much detail, I want you to take a second and just try to think of what you remember about it. What's the general sequence of events? So you can pause the presentation, take a couple seconds, just jot a couple notes down, just so you can kind of gather yourself into this scientific mindset. Okay, so the scientific method, the exact order that this goes in can be different, but this is how we're going to go for it. So first, it's based on some kind of theory, and we're going to talk about theories in the next slide, but we have some kind of prediction that comes from past research or other theories that guides what we are doing. Then you form a hypothesis, collect data, analyze it, and the entire thing you've got to do, you make sure that you've done it ethically. So theory. Let's talk first about how we come up with theories. So when I ask you questions in the discussion board about how you could come up with certain research topics, this is some of the ways that you might think about how you would do it. So the first one, there's this old saying that research is me-search, meaning that people oftentimes will research things that they are interested in themselves for their own personal reasons. I do research in religion because I'm interested in what it means to be religious from old theological arguments I had with myself and other people, but that's really what led me to the research I do. So you can come up with thoughts about how you think something has occurred in your life. Why has something occurred in your life? And come up with your pet theory because of it. And then you can see if that's actually the case. It might be that other people are similar to you in certain ways. It might be that they are very different than you in other ways. The second way in here, past research, and this would be in conjunction. Part one would require part two also. The research is me-search would require you looking into the past research at the end, but not at the beginning. So if you were interested in why something occurs, you might just go and look on psych articles or psych info and see what they have to say. Why do these things occur? What is the evidence from past research? And in that way, you can see you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can try to use what other people have done, which in science is a good thing, not plagiarizing, of course, but using the work that they've done to build off of it and move into your own direction. And then third is that you can just look at everyday occurrences. This is almost like the naturalistic observation, just what is going on in your life, in the world, speculate what is happening. Why are these things occurring? There's going to be a whole lot of good research coming up as I record this. We are in the midst of the Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, possibly, but not likely, Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, and from afar you can make some you can make some observations about why these things are occurring, and do some research based off of that. But nonetheless, our theories must be falsifiable. And falsificationism is somewhat complex. So you don't have to fully get this, but try to follow with me here. So falsificationism is the idea that it is logically possible to prove that a theory is false, because any observations that run counter to that prove that it's false. So for example, all elephants are purple. Well, if you find one elephant that is not purple, then you have found that that is false. So your theory is gone. However, we can't prove that theories are true. So let's take our theory about elephants again. All elephants are purple. The only way to prove that that was true would be to find every elephant in the world and see what color it is. But even beyond that, truly, it would require you to observe every elephant that has ever been and ever will be for your theory to have any relative importance long term. So we can't do that. It's literally impossible to do that. So we cannot prove a theory true. This is part of the reason that we never use the P word. Now, in practice, theories can't actually be proven false because there's always alternative explanations. So if you have your purple elephants theory and you find a non-purple elephant, there is the potential that there's some kind of alternative explanation, some third variable added in here. Maybe for some reason the mud that they were rolling around in is interacting with the sunlight through some environmental filter that makes it look like they're not purple even though they really are. There's always things it could be, but the most important thing is that we cannot prove that a theory is true. So, what we are trying to do, the goal of science, is to expose our theories to attempts at falsificationism. It might sound odd, but truly, from a purely scientific perspective, anytime you do a study, what you're doing is trying to show that your theory is false. The best theories survive the falsificationism process the best. And new theories come up, replace the old, and science works more and more and more, better, better, better. And this is, in my mind and for others, the logical line of demarcation between science and non-science. That science is where you are systematically trying to find the truth. That is, in fact, my definition of science, the systematic search for truth. And in non-science, you're not doing that. Now, it's important also to note that in a part of this, and to get into more detail, take my developmental psychology class, but to really fully get the understanding down is this second bullet point I have here. The best theory is the one that survives the falsificationism process best. We will repeatedly expose our theories at attempts at falsificationism so that one observation that runs counter to our theory does not damn the theory. There was that one famous study that showed that autism is related to vaccinations. Well, then there were all of these other studies that tried to replicate that, and they did not find that. So there have been hundreds of studies that now show that there is no relationship between autism and vaccinations. So we can always have the one study that shows something weird is going on. And in fact, the reason that that study was found, you guys probably know, is the doctor who put this study forth about autism and vaccinations. He actually made up the data and was disbarred. He's no longer a doctor. But there's always a chance that we can find one weird result, one weird correlation. And so we have to do this over and over and over again. So the second, hypotheses. So hypotheses is where you form some kind of testable statement about your research. And in the science realm, we have null and alternative hypotheses. If you have a hypothesis that trauma is correlated to depression, you have the alternative, trauma is not correlated to depression. And for those of you who took my stats class already, you would know that we'd actually flip that, but it doesn't matter. We have two theories. Trauma is correlated to depression or it's not, and one of those two is right. So we set up our first study where trauma is correlated to depression and it's not correlated to depression. Well, let's say we find that trauma is correlated to depression. Well, then you move on to the next study and you come up with a new hypothesis that physical trauma is correlated to depression or physical trauma is not correlated to depression. Let's say you find that physical trauma is correlated to depression. So because of the results of the first and the second study, you move to your third study. Physical trauma in natural disasters is more related to depression than emotional trauma, or it's not. And it keeps progressing like that. And this, through our falsificationism, but now we have our hypotheses involved here, we can get closer and closer to whatever the truth is. And how do we do this? Well, we collect data. And there are many different types of studies. We've already talked about some of them. So there are case studies. For those of you who remember in intro psych, Phineas Gage or patient HM were both people who had brain injuries that we could not ethically replicate. And so they are single people who tell us something about the phenomena we are interested in. You guys likely understand case studies a little bit. We will rarely use them in developmental psychology, though, because we're interested in large trends over time. We're not as interested in individual people. Naturalistic observation, we talked about with our theorists, but that's where you just go and you observe people. One of the things that many developmental psychologists will do, and we talked about this in a past lecture, but that is record children interacting in a playground or something like that, and then go back and code it and watch it again and again to determine exactly what was happening, get really good data in that way. So you can observe people in their environment. Correlational studies and experimental design are pretty good actually to contrast to one another. So in a correlational study, we do correlational studies when we can't do experimental designs. So experimental designs are where you have two different groups, or two or more different groups, or minimally you manipulate a variable. So you could take a group of 100 people, you could randomly assign 50 of them to be in one experimental condition and another to be in the control. Well, in developmental psychology, we use correlational studies when we can't do that. So how does number of children impact the mental health of parents? Well, if we were to do an experiment, we would take 50 or 100, let's say 100 families or mother-father dyads. And we'd randomly assign half of them to have a certain number of children and half of the others, or the other half, to have a different number of children. Well, obviously we can't do that ethically. We can't control that. So instead what we would do is we would look out into the population and find people who have 2 children and 3 children and 4 and 5 and 6, and then compare them. So we haven't randomly assigned them into their groups, meaning the number of children they have, but we can then see correlationally what is the relationship between number of children and mental health or well-being. So in correlational studies, we can't know the exact direction of causality, but we do the best we can. Whereas experimental designs, that's where we can actually implement some kind of manipulation. Ethically, practically, we can do that. Another one that we're going to talk about later in the semester is in media. There are some experiments that want to look to how much the amount of media exposure a child is exposed to relates to aggression. And so we can do some experiments. We could have an experimental group where one group of children watches a social learning theory Bobo doll-like video and another who doesn't, and see what happens. But we might not be able to do something larger, like expose children for 1 year to literally no violence on television. Well, we could try to do that experimentally, but practically that's probably not going to happen. So in that case, we might turn to a correlational study. So as I say in here, these are chosen based on the research questions you are asking, and everyone knows that there are advantages and disadvantages to each of them. So if you have a new theory, you want to look at something completely new happens. So a self-driving car. What kind of study might you want to do there? Well, you might not even know what would be appropriate. How are people going to act in self-driving cars? Are people going to be watching the road, or are they going to be on their phones the whole time? Are they going to trust it or not? So we might want to do a naturalistic observation study first before we move on to something bigger. Or we might know that we have a lot of past research that supports a certain type of intervention, but maybe we want to tweak a different one. That could be an experimental design. So it completely depends. So next up we have our data analysis, and I'll just say off the bat, take descriptive statistics in order to understand data analysis better. But I do want to give you a little bit of information specifically about correlation, and we'll talk about why correlation is so important in a second. So if you have scatter plots where along one of the axes there's one variable, let's say trauma, and along the y-axis, let's just say is depression, what's the relationship between trauma and depression? What we'd see in a perfect positive correlation is a 1 unit increase in one variable leads to a 1 unit increase in the other. So as you go up, there's this perfect linear relationship. That is a perfect positive correlation of 1. This is a correlation of -1. These never happen in real life. You will never, never, never see a correlation of 1 unless you are measuring height in inches and height in centimeters, because they are the same thing, just different units. What you might see more of is something like this, where there's a high positive correlation. So this correlation is high positive, and this one is low positive. So this one is probably something like a 0.7 correlation. The one on the right is maybe a little lower, 0.4, something like that. But these are still pretty much, you can see there's no outliers. There's nobody who's, really low down here, really high up here. This is a pretty strong trend. This is a little less strong, but it's still there. Here we have high negative and a low negative correlation, and they're the same way. You can interpret them the same way or similarly, except there's a negative relationship instead of a positive relationship. But before we talk about correlation in any more detail, I want to point out that correlation does not equal causation. And here are just a few slides to emphasize this to you. That people who drowned after falling out of a fishing boat correlates with marriage rates in Kentucky. Divorce rate in Maine correlates with per capita consumption of margarine. Number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets correlates with total revenue generated by skiing facilities. And per capita consumption of sour cream correlates with people who died by falling out of their wheelchair. Okay, so this clearly, none of these variables have a relationship with one another at a causal level. Sour cream consumption is not causing people to die falling out of their wheelchair. I think we can all agree with that. Instead, there just is a mathematical correlation. So this is something that you will see if you do take this, descriptive statistics, that we will be doing a lot of correlation, but not every correlation is meaningful. This is an extremely high correlation. As you see on here, it's a correlation of 0.888. That's super high. You will almost never see that. The correlation between trauma and depression is not 0.888. So this brings us to the next point, which is why do we talk so much about correlation in descriptive statistics? Well, we talk a lot about correlation because we use correlation so much. In developmental psychology, in particular, we are unable to do many of the studies that we might like to do in an experiment. We cannot randomly assign people to be raised with a same-sex couple or a non-same-sex couple. We just can't do that. We can't take people and make them get a college degree or not have them get a college degree. We can't do these things. So instead, we turn to correlational studies and we compare the people who have a college degree with those who don't. There's no experimental method here. They're not randomly assigned into their groups as you would in a true experiment, but we use the best we can, which is just to see what the differences are. This adds a larger layer of complication to it, but that's something that we get into in those kinds of stats classes. And then the last of these points in the scientific method that I had was ethics. So the IRB, Institutional Review Board. Every college and university in the country that does any kind of research, including the University of Montevallo, has an IRB, an Internal Review Board. And the purpose of this IRB is to look at studies that people are trying to do and just see if that is approved. Do they think that that's okay to do? Back in the day, there were more controversies than now. But one of the controversies that used to occur was research on animals. In the 60s and 70s, there were many psychology labs that actually had monkeys of one sort or another, in their basement. And they would do studies. They had monkeys in cages, honest to God. And they would do experiments that now people probably wouldn't want to have associated with their college or university. So this rarely comes up where today there are these big conflicts between what people want to do and what they can do, but we still make sure to do it. Then the second point is confidentiality. We want to make sure that the data we have are accurate. We also want to be nice to the people and who are doing the studies and make sure that their data don't get out. But practically, as scientists, we are most concerned with, even maybe if we shouldn't, are our data accurate? Well, if you are interested in teenage sexual behaviors and the teenager is unsure if you are going to give the information to their parents, do you think they're going to tell you the truth? I would kind of doubt it. So because of that, it's super important that we keep people's information confidential. We do that by having password protected computers, having our data separated from any kind of identifying information. So even if people came and picked up all the data we had, they wouldn't be able to tell what it was. At Virginia Tech, where I did my master's and PhD, our data were kept. The only way that you could figure out who did what study was by getting a file that was on a ghost drive on a password protected computer in a locked room in a locked building. So we take it very, very seriously. We have had, I personally have been asked by parents before if they could tell, if I could tell them how their children answered questions about sexuality, substance abuse. You'd be surprised. And every time I had to say no, because if we did that, we would be breaching ethical protocols, but we're also going to screw with the trust that the child and parent has about us. And then last up on here is deception. Is there a problem with deception? How do you feel about it? Well, as a participant, there are concerns that come up. You have to fill out a informed consent. You have to say, yes, I want to be a part of the study. We can't just randomly make people be parts of studies. Well, sometimes if we tell you what the study is about, you'll figure it out. So in the Ash line study about conformity, if we tell you this study is about conformity and then do something that might have you need to conform or feel that need, you're going to say, oh, I'm not going to conform. I know that's part of the study. So we have to have deception, but it can make people feel uncomfortable. So how do you feel about it? How far would you allow deception to go? This is actually part of the question that IRBs oftentimes answer. All right, so let's now move back to our big question. How are research methods different for developmental psychology and other aspects of psychology? Well, part of the reason that I bring this up is that some of the theorists that we talk about at the beginning of the semester are in other aspects of psychology. Their work is there too. So, for example, if we were to talk about Freud, you see Freud in many different areas of psychology. You'll talk about him if you take intro or psychopathology or many different aspects. Piaget, you could talk about him in cognitive. Ethology and evolution can talk about in basically any class. You can talk about many of these people in many classes. So what is different about developmental psychology? Just take a minute and think about what that might be. Okay, so to me there are kind of an endless number of answers here, but there's a couple big things I want to point out. And the main issue that I want to point out is that in developmental psychology, these days, we want to do studies longitudinally. And this is the biggest difference, practical difference, between us and other areas. And that means that we follow children or adults or whoever we are doing from one point and we see how they're doing later down the line. So if you are interested in whether or not same-sex marriage is a good thing or a bad thing or a neutral thing for the children, are you going to just measure them when they're 6? Or do you want to measure them when they're 12? Or 15? Or 18? Or 30? Or when? Well, ideally, we would be able to measure them many times throughout life to get a developmental trajectory. But regardless, we want to have multiple times so we can see how people grow and change. There are few other areas that really do this. Now, sometimes when there are developmental aspects of those fields, they might have it. So if you are a cognitive psychologist who is interested in the development of memory, then you might do that. But that's then gets back to kind of a developmental perspective as well. So there are other ways that this is going to be one of the discussion board questions, and some of the examples I want you to try to come up with are going to be on there as well. But really, I hope this has given you a chance to think a little bit more in depth about how we do research, why research is so important, and then how, in many ways, the theorists we've talked about for basically the entire semester so far, their methodology, while we use some of it still, that they're we don't really look to them anymore because we have kind of advanced beyond what they were able to do. None of them were able to do MRI or EEG or things like that, but even more advanced ways of doing computer simulations, studies with computers, being able to videotape people. That's something that many people didn't have access to for long, long periods of time. So they are oftentimes kind of out of date. But they're still really important to understand how we have got where we have got and to see the different ways that our research to this point has been influenced by them. And I'll leave you with this. These are some more potentially controversial examples. And I would like you to think, and this is more test prep than it is discussion board, whether or not same-sex couples parent differently than opposite-sex couples, whether or not genetically modified organisms influence cognitive development, whether or not universal pre-K will have a positive influence on development, and how each of our theorists would look at these questions differently. I should point out here that I don't care what you think about it. The question is not what would be the results of this study, simply how would they study it? How would they set up the methodology?